My name is Sienna Hart. I'm 32 years old and I own 8 artisan bakeries across San Diego. People call what I've built inspiring. They say my story is beautiful, and maybe from the outside it is. But beauty doesn't erase the way certain sounds can pull you back through time and land you somewhere small and terrified again. That's what happened the day my phone wouldn't stop ringing. I was in the back office reviewing invoices, checking staff schedules, doing the kind of ordinary work that made up a Tuesday afternoon at Second Morning. That's the name of my business. The screen kept lighting up. Unknown numbers. Numbers I hadn't saved in my contacts, but somehow, in the deep muscle of my memory, I already recognized. I let it ring. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 30. I kept moving, frosting cakes, signing forms, checking temperatures on the ovens, acting like my hands weren't trembling, acting like the sound of that phone wasn't doing what it was doing, which was dragging me straight back to being 8 years old. Because the last time I sat waiting for those people, I was a little girl in a plastic chair in a place that smelt like bleach and old blankets. I had a tiny suitcase beside me. I was waiting for someone to come back through the door and say there had been a mistake. They never did. My mother took my brother, my father took my sister, and I was left behind at a children's home called Hope House. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because I was difficult or dangerous, but because when my family started falling apart and had to decide who to carry with them, I was the one nobody had room for. I was the extra piece. For years after that, many, many years, there was nothing. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no visits, no letters, nothing that said, "We see you, we remember you, you still matter to us." The silence was complete, and in its own way, it was its own kind of answer. Then I gave a television interview, a local segment about small business and community impact. And near the end, the anchor asked a question I hadn't fully prepared for. Where does your drive to help young people come from? And something in me decided the truth deserved to breathe. So I told her, not every detail, but enough. I said I had been left in a children's home at 8. I said I grew up in the foster system. I said the work I do is built on the kind of support I desperately needed as a child and never received. The clip went online that evening. By the next morning, it had been reshared hundreds of times. A newspaper picked it up. A larger outlet ran a full feature with my photograph. And for the first time in print, the word appeared that my family had spent 2 decades avoiding: abandoned. I stared at that word on my phone screen for a long time. I felt no shame, only clarity. 3 days later, the call started coming. Unknown numbers, familiar rhythms, voices I hadn't heard in over 20 years. My brother Owen, my sister Chloe, my mother, my father, one after another reaching through decades of silence, as if the time between then and now was just a small gap to step across. I let every call ring out. 5 minutes, 10, 30, and standing there in my bakery, the one I had built with my own hands out of nothing, I understood something about silence that I hadn't known when I was 8. Silence can be two very different things. It can be what gets done to you when you're powerless, or it can be what you choose when you finally have the power to decide who gets access to you and when. That Tuesday afternoon, for the first time in my life, the silence belonged to me. But before I tell you what happened when I finally opened that door to the past, let me take you back to the beginning, back to a sun-baked house in Tucson with a cracked driveway and a lemon tree that never gave quite enough fruit. We looked normal from the outside. That is the first thing you need to understand about the Hart family. Because normal looking is one of the most dangerous masks a struggling family can wear. It hides the fractures long past the point they can be repaired. We lived in Tucson, Arizona, one-story house, modest neighborhood. My mother, Marlene, worked at a public elementary school. My father, Daniel, managed shipping for a warehouse at the edge of town. My older brother, Owen, was the kind of boy adults called easy. Calm, organized, smart, good at reading a room. My little sister, Chloe, was all curls and questions and sticky fingers reaching for whatever was nearest. And I was the one in the middle, old enough to notice things, young enough to still believe that love was supposed to be steady. For a while, it was. Saturday mornings meant pancakes. Summer weekends meant cheap folding chairs in the backyard and burgers burning a little on the grill. Friday movie nights meant Chloe falling asleep halfway through and Owen pretending not to notice when I tucked the blanket over both of us. For a stretch of years that I still hold carefully in my memory, home felt safe. Not perfect, but safe. And for a child, safe is everything. Then my father lost his job. At first, he called it temporary. Then he said the company had restructured. Then he stopped explaining it all. My mother picked up extra shifts, and the air inside the house changed in ways no one named out loud, but everyone felt. Bills began to stack on the kitchen counter. Conversations that used to happen at normal volume moved behind closed doors, then started leaking under them anyway. You always know when adults are lying about everything being fine. They smile too quickly. They ask too many questions about school. They avoid your eyes at exactly the moments when a child most needs to be seen. My father started sleeping on the couch. My mother stopped laughing at things that used to make her laugh. Owen retreated to his room. Chloe got clingy and scared. And I became the child who listened. I listened through walls. I listened at the bottom of the stairs. I listened because nobody was telling me the truth, and I had a growing feeling that the truth had my name somewhere inside it. The night I understood how serious things had become, I heard my mother say clearly through their bedroom door, "We cannot keep living like this." My father's reply came fast and sharp, "Then leave." What followed wasn't an argument. It was a silence with weight in it, the kind that tells you something permanent has entered the room. A week later, they gathered us at the kitchen table. They spoke gently, carefully, like they were reading from a script they had rehearsed without us. They said it wasn't our fault. They said they both loved us. They said families could change shape and still be families. Then real life started pressing through the cracks in that prepared speech. Who would live where, what school districts were affordable, what could actually be managed, and the softer, more careful question they were clearly dancing around: which parent would take which child? I remember the particular quality of that silence when the question of me came up. Not a long silence, not a dramatic pause, just nothing. No one said my name first. No one jumped in with, "I want Sienna." No one leaned forward with, "She'll come with me, obviously." Nobody said, "What about Sienna?" until the moment when enough had already been said for me to understand what the answer would sound like. Later that night, I stood in the hallway outside their room. My mother's voice, tight and exhausted, "You take her." My father's reply, quicker than I expected, "I can barely handle one child right now. She's too emotional." Then my mother, and these are the words that lived under my skin for years. She said, "Just for a little while. Maybe Hope House can keep her until we get settled." Keep her, like I was a box, like I was something to be stored until the inconvenience of me no longer applied. 2 days later, my mother packed my clothes into a small suitcase without folding them properly. My father drove, and nobody called it abandonment. They called it temporary. They called it a few weeks. They called it the best thing for everyone. I was 8 years old. I believed them. Hope House sat behind a chain-link fence with the sign that had been faded by sun for so long the letters looked like they were giving up. The front office smelled like coffee, disinfectant, and something else, a particular kind of institutional stillness that I would later recognize as the smell of children waiting. The woman at the front desk smiled at me in that careful way adults do when they know something terrible is happening and want to be credited for being gentle about it. My mother knelt in front of me and fixed my collar even though nothing was wrong with it. My father signed papers without looking up from the desk. Chloe had been left in the car. Owen was back home with my aunt. Everyone had decided, without saying it, that they didn't want this moment to feel too real. "We'll come back for you soon," my mother said, "as soon as things settle down." My father finally looked at me. "Be good, okay? It'll just be for a little while." I remember standing very still, watching both of their faces, waiting for one of them to crack, waiting for someone to decide this was in. Hope House sat behind a chain-link fence with a sign that had been faded by sun for so long the letters looked like they were giving up. The front office smelled like coffee, disinfectant, and something else, a particular kind of institutional stillness that I would later recognize as the smell of children waiting. The woman at the front desk smiled at me in that careful way adults do when they know something terrible is happening and want to be credited for being gentle about it. My mother knelt in front of me and fixed my collar even though nothing was wrong with it. My father signed papers without looking up from the desk. Chloe had been left in the car. Owen was back home with my aunt. Everyone had decided, without saying it, that they didn't want this moment to feel too real. "We'll come back for you soon," my mother said, "as soon as things settle down." My father finally looked at me. "Be good, okay? It'll just be for a little while." I remember standing very still, watching both of their faces, waiting for one of them to crack, waiting for someone to decide this was insane and take me back to the car. Instead, my mother kissed my forehead. My father picked up the pen he had almost left behind, and then they walked out the door. They did not turn around, they did not wave, they did not come back that weekend, or the next, or the one after that. My first night at Hope House, I slept in a narrow twin bed with a plastic mattress cover that crackled every time I moved. The room had 4 girls in it, but no one spoke after lights out. One cried quietly into her pillow. Another stared at the ceiling with the practiced blankness of someone who had run out of things to expect. I kept my shoes on because I thought my parents might come late and I needed to be ready to leave quickly. That was the kind of child I still was then. Not angry yet, just prepared. The next morning, I found the chair nearest the window in the day room, the one with the clearest view of the parking lot. I figured if they came, I wanted to see them first. A white sedan pulled in around noon, and my heart stopped, but it was a volunteer delivering canned goods. After lunch, a caseworker asked if I wanted to make a thank you card for my family for arranging safe care while they got back on their feet. I looked at her and thought, "You don't know them at all." But I was 8 and frightened, so I nodded. I took the crayons. Every adult around me seemed more comfortable with the version of my story where I had not truly been left, so for a few days I tried to live inside that version too. I made the card, I sat by the window, I counted the days by weekends. By the second week, even the staff stopped using the phrase, "when your family comes back," and started saying, "if there are any updates." There is an enormous difference between those kinds of sentences. One keeps a child breathing, the other slowly teaches her not to expect air. A girl who had been at Hope House longer than me asked on my 4th day, "Did they tell you they were coming back?" I said yes. She shrugged. "They always say that," she told me, and walked away as if she had handed me a piece of information rather than a wound. I stopped sitting by the window after that, but I kept listening for footsteps. I kept watching the front door every time it opened. I kept believing that certain sounds meant rescue. They did not. By the time my 9th birthday passed with no card, no cake, no voice from home, something deep inside me went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the quiet of a child who has finally understood what is actually true. I stopped asking the staff whether there had been any updates. I stopped making excuses for the people who made a choice and then built an entirely new life around pretending it hadn't been a choice at all. That was the year I learned to make myself useful. Useful children get noticed less. Useful children cause less trouble. Useful children survive longer. When I moved out of Hope House and into foster care, I did what most children in that position do. I imagined it would be better. You picture a porch light left on for you, a woman who remembers what cereal you like, a man who teaches you to ride a bike on a Sunday afternoon like it's the most natural thing in the world, a bedroom that smells like clean laundry and belonging. What I got instead was a series of houses where I learned just how many different ways a person can make you feel temporary without ever saying the word. My first placement was with a couple who already had 3 biological sons and took in foster children for the government stipend. They weren't cruel in any obvious way. That almost made it harder. Monsters are easier to process. These people were simply indifferent, the kind of hollow, slow indifference that drains you without leaving marks. My clothes lived in garbage bags for months because nobody thought to give me proper drawer space. I slept on a fold-out couch in a den with no door. When relatives came to visit, I was quietly told to make myself scarce before anyone had to ask twice. I became very efficient at disappearing. When they eventually decided they were overwhelmed and needed to focus on their real family, I was moved again. That phrase, real family, lodged itself in me and stayed for years, as if I had been a rehearsal that didn't go anywhere. My second placement had too many children and not enough adult attention to go around. Food disappeared quickly. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. I changed schools again, which meant going through the exhausting ritual of being the new girl, the one with no clean answer when teachers asked where home was. I learned to say, with my guardian, because it stopped the follow-up questions faster than the truth did. Then came the foster mother who understood precisely where to press. In public, she begged casseroles for the church food drive and called every child sweetheart. In private, she had a talent for the kind of cruelty that doesn't leave visible damage. She would look at me over the kitchen table and say things like, "You should smile more. People don't warm up to girls with that look on their face." And once, quietly, while I was washing dishes, "Maybe if you were easier to love, somebody would have kept you." She never raised her hand to me. She didn't need to. She went after the part of me that still, despite everything, held a small flame of hope that I had been worth staying for. By that point, I had absorbed an ugly truth about how the world reads foster children. Once a child has already been abandoned, people tend to assume she can absorb a little more damage. Adults see a girl who is quiet and functioning, and they decide she is fine, when the reality is she has simply gotten exceptional at bleeding on the inside. The body keeps a record of what the mind learns to set aside. I clenched my jaw so hard in my sleep that I woke up with headaches. I flinched at the sound of doors slamming. I apologized constantly for taking up space, for needing things, for simply existing in rooms where I hadn't been explicitly welcomed. I said sorry so often it stopped meaning anything and became more of a reflex, a preemptive offering to anyone who might decide I was too much. I was not fine, but I was functional, and for a long time I confused those two things. What I had learned was this: the system is not built to catch everything that breaks inside a child. It's built to provide housing, meals, and a basic level of oversight. The interior damage, the slow erosion of self-worth, the trained inability to trust, the constant state of waiting for the next loss, that isn't visible on any intake form. Nobody writes, "This child no longer believes she deserves to be kept," in the case notes. But that is exactly what had happened to me, quietly, placement by placement, year by year. I had started to believe that my own abandonment was a verdict rather than a crime. The thing that saved my life didn't arrive with fanfare. It didn't announce itself. It smelled like warm bread and yeast, and it came in the form of an old man with flour on a shirt who treated me like someone capable of mastery rather than someone in need of management. His name was Ramon Ellis. Everyone called him Chef, even when he hadn't worked in a restaurant for years. He ran the baking station at a church meal program on Saturday mornings, the same program one of my foster placements sent me to help with, framing it, as they always did, as character building. In foster care, free labor always gets renamed character building. Chef Ramon had silver at his temples and a voice that was steady in the way a well-built structure is steady. He didn't speak loudly or urgently, he simply said what needed to be done and expected you to pay attention. He showed me how to level flour with the back of a knife rather than scooping it loose. He showed me how yeast needed to wake up in warm water, not hot, which would kill it, and not cold, which would leave it sleeping. He showed me how dough changes when you give it time instead of forcing it, how patience is not a passive act, but an active ingredient. The first time I pulled a tray of dinner rolls from the oven, I stood there and stared at them for a long moment. They had risen because of what I had done. They had transformed because I had followed every step and waited long enough for the change to happen. That moment sounds small. For me, it was everything. People were always unpredictable. Rules had always shifted. Love had always arrived with an exit attached. But baking responded to consistency. It rewarded attention. It asked for discipline and then, without fail, gave you something warm and real in return. I started volunteering for every kitchen shift available. I learned biscuits, cinnamon rolls, braided loaves, simple fruit pies. Chef Ramon corrected me when I rushed and made me start over when I got sloppy, but he also gave me something no adult in the system had thought to give me: respect. Not sympathy, not pity, respect. The kind that says, I believe you are capable of doing this well. There is an enormous difference between those two things. I was old enough by then to know which one I had been starving for. Around the same time, a guidance counselor named Mrs. Vivian Brooks noticed something in the way I wrote about my future. When school assignments asked students to imagine where they'd be in 10 years, most kids wrote vague, hopeful half sentences. I wrote plans. Mrs. Brooks pulled me aside one afternoon and asked why I spent my lunch breaks helping cafeteria staff stack trays. I told her I liked kitchens. She looked at me with the kind of steady attention that makes you feel truly seen, and she said, "No, you like order. You like making things happen with your hands." That sentence hit me hard because it was the first time any adult had described me in terms that had nothing to do with damage or survival. She wasn't saying I was resilient or brave or impressive for having been through so much. She was simply telling me who I was. Mrs. Brooks helped me apply to a vocational program with culinary electives. Chef Ramon let me practice on Saturday mornings, even when there was nothing scheduled. I started waking early to bake before school whenever I had access to a kitchen. When I didn't, I wrote recipes in the margins of old notebooks and memorized measurements like they were prayers. Foster life did not suddenly become easy. I was moved again. I still learned not to unpack too much. There were still nights when anger rose in me so hot I had to sit on my hands to keep from breaking something. But there was now a small, stubborn light burning inside me. Every time I worked with dough, every time butter melted into flour, every time a crust turned golden at exactly the right moment, I felt less like the leftover child. I felt more like someone becoming. Being left behind, I was beginning to understand, does not mean you are meant to stay there. I aged out of the foster system at 18 with one duffel bag, a folder full of paperwork no one had properly explained to me, and a scholarship to a community college culinary program that felt almost too small to carry the size of what I needed it to do. San Diego was where I landed. I moved into a shared apartment with two other young women who didn't care where I'd come from as long as I paid rent on time and kept the sink clean. That felt like freedom. Real, specific, uncomplicated freedom. Nobody asked me to perform gratitude for being allowed to stay. I enrolled in culinary classes during the day. I worked mornings at a diner that served breakfast to men in work boots and women still wearing perfume from the night before. At night, I cleaned equipment at a small bakery in North Park until my back ached and my fingers went numb from hot water and cleaning products. I did homework at bus stops. I memorized inventory costs while waiting tables. I survived on coffee, toast, and a kind of determination that lives close enough to anger to be confused with it at times. I understood by then something that most people take much longer to learn. Stability is expensive. Peace is expensive. Not having to beg is expensive. And when you come from nothing, every ordinary thing feels like a mountain with a billing statement attached. I started selling my own pastries at a weekend farmer's market. Honey sea salt rolls, brown butter muffins, cardamom buns that sold out before 10 in the morning on cold days when people wanted something warm to hold. At first, I was just trying to cover gas and textbooks, but then I noticed something. People came back. They brought their friends. They asked where my shop was. I didn't have one, not yet. But for the first time in my life, not yet sounded like possibility rather than prohibition. The market was where I met Tessa Monroe. She had a booth nearby selling handmade ceramic mugs, talked faster than anyone I had ever encountered, and had a business mind wrapped inside a messy bun and a leather jacket. She looked at my pricing board one morning and said, without preamble, "You're undercharging by at least 20% and smiling like it's a personality trait." I laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one. Nobody had ever critiqued me so directly without trying to make me feel small while doing it. Tessa became my first real friend in adulthood. Not a counselor, not a mentor. A friend, the kind who showed up with coffee during a breakdown over rent and who could stare at a spreadsheet like it was interesting gossip. A few months later, I met Adrian Cole. He came into the bakery where I worked nights because his architecture firm was doing late hours nearby, and for a full week, he ordered the same black coffee and one plain croissant every time, as if he were too exhausted to allow himself anything better. On the 8th day, he asked who made the orange rosemary scones. I said I did. He took one bite and closed his eyes like he was having a spiritual experience in front of the pastry case. I should have found that ridiculous. Instead, I laughed so hard I had to look away. Adrian was patient with people in a way I initially found suspicious. Men who move gently can feel unreal when your nervous system has been trained on chaos and loss. But he never pushed. He never tried to excavate my past before I was ready. He respected my ambition. He asked real questions and actually waited for real answers. That kind of patience made room for trust. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly. The only kind of slowly I had ever learned to believe in. At 25, I launched Second Morning, named for the simple truth that some people get one clean beginning and some of us have to build a second one entirely by hand. I started with pop-ups, then private catering, then a tiny breakfast window inside a shared food hall that barely held 2 employees and a standing mixer. But it was proof. It was evidence that what I was going could work. I was terrified the entire time, but fear is different when it's riding next to purpose. It still talks. It just doesn't get to steer. By the time I was 32, Second Morning had grown into 8 locations across San Diego County. Each one builds around the same principles that had quietly saved me years before in someone else's kitchen. Consistency, warmth, dignity, good bread, and a room where no one has to earn the right to stay seating. We had hired over 40 employees, including several young adults who had aged out of the foster system, because I knew exactly what it meant to reach adulthood with no network, no safety net, and nowhere soft to land. We had launched a paid apprenticeship program, partnered with a housing nonprofit, and held free monthly budgeting workshops at our flagship location, because nobody teaches children in the foster system what adulthood actually costs until the rent is already due. The press found me around this time. Local newspapers, morning news segments, lifestyle magazines. They called me resilient. They called me self-made. They photographed me beside racks of pastries in linen blazers and ran headlines like "Orphan turned entrepreneur," as though survival had been a branding exercise rather than a private war fought in increments over decades. I understood the value of coverage, so I did the interviews. I smiled and answered questions and let them have the version of the story they needed to tell. But every time someone said the word resilient, I had to resist the urge to ask whether they wanted the version with the warm lighting or the one that included the panic attacks, the years of hypervigilance, the apologizing for existing, and the long, slow work of rebuilding a self that had been systematically dismantled before I was old enough to understand what was happening. Still, the attention helped, so I used it. Then came the interview that changed everything. It began as a routine local segment, small business growth and community impact, the kind of feature that runs between weather and sports on a Tuesday evening. Near the end of the interview, the anchor asked an unexpected question. You talk a lot about creating second chances for young people. Where does that come from for you personally? Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was ready. Maybe some part of me had decided that the truth deserved to exist somewhere outside my own body for once. So I told it. Not every brutal detail, but enough. I said I had been placed in a children's home at 8 years old. I said I grew up moving through the foster system. I said everything I had built was constructed on the foundation of the support I wish someone had fought to give me decades earlier. That night, the clip went online. By morning, a larger account had reposted it. By afternoon, a newspaper had picked it up and written a full feature with old photographs, business figures, and a headline that finally used the word my family had spent 24 years carefully avoiding: abandoned. I stared at that word on my phone for a long time. I felt no shame reading it. I felt something clearer and quieter than shame. I felt true. 3 days after the article ran, the phone started ringing. Unknown numbers I somehow recognized, voices I hadn't heard in over 20 decades, each one carrying the same thing underneath its particular tone: urgency wrapped in the costume of love. My brother Owen left the first voicemail. His voice was deeper than I remembered, but the rhythm of it was the same. "See, it's me. I know this is a shock. Please call me back. There's a lot you don't know." I sat completely still after that message ended. My assistant manager knocked on the office door to check on me. I said I was fine, which was functional rather than true, but the distinction was familiar. Then Chloe called, and she was crying before she finished saying my name. Then my mother, sounding older and heavier, like regret had taken residence in her chest. Then my father, then Owen again. Each message tried a different approach: informational, emotional, urgent. "We need to talk. Please just hear us out. Your father is sick. We've been looking for you." I let every single one ring out. And this time, the silence was mine. I didn't call them back right away. I listened to each voicemail twice, then forwarded the numbers to Tessa. Tessa Monroe has the instincts of a private investigator operating inside the life of a businesswoman, and she applies them with the casual efficiency of someone who finds fact far more useful than comfort. She didn't do anything improper, no invasions, no hacking, no shortcuts. She simply knew how to navigate public records, social media history, local news archives, and the kind of digital footprints people leave when their lives stop holding together neatly. By the end of that week, the picture was clear enough to make the timing of their sudden outreach feel considerably less like love and considerably more like strategy. My mother, Marlene, had remarried some years after the divorce. That marriage had collapsed roughly 18 months before my interview went public. Her second husband had left following a lengthy financial crisis she had apparently kept hidden from most of the people in her life. She was alone, financially precarious, and newly without a partner for the first time in years. My father, Daniel, had developed serious health problems and was living alone in a one-bedroom rental outside Phoenix. He had gone through whatever savings he had accumulated and was now living in the stripped-back way that happens when bad health meets limited resources and there's no one close by to help manage the gap. Owen had been working in regional sales until he became entangled in an internal expense fraud investigation at his company. He had lost his job. His professional reputation, the thing he had always seemed to build his identity around, had taken a significant blow. Chloe's situation was more complicated. According to what Tessa found, she had moved in and out of contact with both parents over the years. At some point, she had apparently learned more of the truth about what had actually happened to me, the full version, not the softened one they had been telling relatives for years, and had pulled back from the family as a result. Her reaching out felt different from the others, messier, more conflicted, and in some ways more honest about how unresolved the whole thing remained for her. In other words, life had done what conscience had never managed to do. It had cornered them. Suddenly, the story they had spent 24 years packaging for public consumption, the version where I was with family friends, or in a special program, or simply edited out of the narrative entirely, was no longer manageable. The daughter they had left behind had become visible. She had become successful. She had become, in the most uncomfortable possible sense, someone worth finding. I held that information for a few days. I let myself feel what it brought up, which was a complicated mixture of emotions that I want to be honest about because the clean revenge narrative would require them to be absent. There was rage, absolutely. There was disgust at the timing, the almost mathematical precision with which their silence had lasted until my life became something they might be able to lean on. But there was also grief, the old kind, the humiliating kind that does not care how well your business is doing or how many people respect you or how fully you have built a life that no longer requires their presence in it. The kind that just notices, very quietly and very painfully, how long it took them to want you. Even when you understand exactly who people are, there is still a part of you that notices how long it took them and bleeds a little. That isn't weakness. It's just what love looks like when it hasn't fully finished grieving. I sat with all of that. I talked to Adrian. I talked to Tessa. I let myself be sad about it in the honest way, rather than the performed strength way I had learned from years of being watched for signs of falling apart. And then I made a decision. I would see them, once, on my terms, in my space, not because they deserved it, not because I owed them anything, but because some truths need to be delivered in person to be fully received. I told them to come to San Diego. I told them to meet me after closing at my flagship location. I chose it deliberately. This was not neutral ground. It was mine. My ovens, my walls, my table. My staff gone home so that nothing in the room could protect them from the clarity of what we were about to do. They arrived together on a Tuesday evening just after 7. I watched them through the front window before I unlocked the door. My father, smaller and dimmer than I remembered, as if life had scraped something essential away. My mother, with the same restless hands, twisting the strap of her purse the way she always did when she was nervous. Owen, with the careful posture of a man who knew he needed mercy and understood he had no right to ask for it. Chloe looking at me the way people look at a grave they have finally located after years of not knowing where to stand. I let them in. Nobody attempted a hug. Good. They sat at the long communal table, the one where strangers usually share pastries on Sunday mornings. Nobody seemed to know how to begin. Finally, my mother said softly, "You look beautiful." It was such a useless sentence for that room. I said, "You didn't come here to describe my face. Start talking." Owen went first. He talked about hard times and regret and things I hadn't understood as a child. My father said he had been overwhelmed, broke, ashamed, and drinking too much. My mother said she had been drowning and believed I would be safer in temporary care than in the instability she was living through. Chloe wept and said she had been told so many different versions of what happened to me that she had eventually stopped knowing what was real. I let them speak. I let them reframe. I let them sand down the sharpest edges of the past until it almost sounded like a story that had simply happened to everyone, equally, without anyone making a choice. Then I stood up, went behind the counter, and returned with 4 slim folders. Each one held copies: placement records, caseworker notes, school transfer forms, aged-out paperwork, a birthday intake form from Hope House with no emergency contact listed. I placed one folder in front of each of them. My hands were steady, my voice was too. That surprised me. I told you all keep using words like hard and overwhelming and complicated. So let me simplify it. You did not lose me. You left me. Nobody moved. I told them about Hope House and the window I used to sit beside, watching for a white car that never came. I told them about the foster home where my clothes lived in garbage bags, the woman who smiled for church and whispered poison in private, the nights I rationed food because I didn't know if there would be enough tomorrow. The schools where I learned not to mention parents because pity made people uncomfortable and cruelty made them curious. The headaches, the insomnia, the apologizing for existing well into my 20s because somewhere along the way I had absorbed the idea that needing anything was dangerous. My mother started crying halfway through. My father stared at the paperwork. Owen covered his mouth. Chloe wept openly. I did not stop. I had waited too long to be interrupted by tears that should have come decades earlier. Then I told them about Chef Ramon and Mrs. Brooks. I told them about Tessa and Adrian. I told them about the life built entirely by people who had no obligation to love me and no blood tie forcing them to stay. I wanted them to understand something essential. They were not sitting across from a broken child who had survived by accident. They were sitting across from a woman who had been rebuilt, deliberately, carefully, stubbornly, by strangers. That was their real indictment. Strangers did what family refused to do. Then my father said the thing he clearly believed would move me most. He said, "I know I don't deserve this," quietly, "but I'm sick, Sienna. I don't have much time. I wanted to make things right before it's too late." Then Owen added, carefully, that he had hoped, with everything I had built, maybe there was a way for the family to get through this stretch together, help with their father's care, maybe help Owen get back on his feet after what he called one terrible mistake. There it was. The need beneath the nostalgia, the urgency beneath the apology. They had not found me because love had finally outrun shame. They had found me because my success looked like shelter. I leaned back in my chair and looked at each of them, one by one, taking my time. Then I said the most honest thing I had ever said to my family. I did not build this life so that the people who abandoned me could come back and use it as a landing pad. My mother flinched. Perhaps that was deserved. Chloe said quickly that she wasn't asking for money, only a chance to rebuild something between us. I believed part of that, maybe most of it. She had been the youngest, the most lied to, the one who had clearly spent years carrying her own version of this grief. So I gave her the only softness I had left available. I told her that maybe, over time, with complete honesty and no pressure and no rewriting of what had actually happened, there could be a conversation between us, just the two of us, slowly. She nodded through tears because even she understood that slow was already more than they deserved. To my mother, I said, "Thinking about me every day while doing nothing is not motherhood." To my father, I said, "A deathbed apology is still late." To Owen, I said, "Being a child once explained your silence. Being a grown man for 20 years does not." I told all of them that I hoped they found good therapy. I hoped they learned to tell the truth, not the tidy version they had been distributing to relatives for 2 decades, but the actual one, the one that used the correct word for what they had done. I hoped they learned to live with what they had chosen without asking me to carry the emotional weight of making them feel forgiven enough to sleep at night. Then I set my boundaries plainly. No money, no funding of medical care, no healing family photograph, no being allowed back into my life based on need and then out again when the crisis passed. If any future contact happened, it would happen in writing first, on my terms, and only if honesty remains the permanent condition of the room. My father cried. The quiet kind, the kind that comes when pride has finally exhausted its supply of useful lies. My mother apologized so many times the words began to dissolve into something that sounded less like language and more like collapse. Owen asked if there was anything they could do to make this right. I said yes. Tell the truth. Tell everyone who still believes the comfortable version of this story exactly what you did. Stop calling it a misunderstanding. Stop hiding behind the word temporary. Say it correctly for once. You left your daughter in care and built new lives around her absence. That is what happened. Live with it. They stayed another 20 minutes, maybe less. No one touched the coffee I had set out by habit. When they left, I locked the door behind them and stood alone in the quiet bakery with the lights low and the smell of tomorrow's bread cold fermenting in the walk-in. Adrian arrived 10 minutes later because Tessa had texted him when the meeting started. He didn't ask if it had gone well. Smart man. He just opened his arms and I stepped into them. In the months that followed, there were emails and letters. Chloe and I exchanged careful, honest messages. Nothing dramatic, nothing warmed too quickly, but truth used for something other than delay. The others I kept at the distance I had promised myself. Today, a portion of every quarterly profit from Second Morning goes into a foundation that funds housing assistance, job training, and emergency grants for young adults aging out of foster care. Not because their stories need to end the way mine did, not everyone has to build a business to survive, but because no child should ever have to become extraordinary simply to live through what the adults around them failed to do. Children remember who stayed. They remember who made excuses. They remember which adults chose to protect them and which ones chose to protect their own comfort instead. And when those children grow up, they deserve more than apologies that arrive only when the person apologizing needs something. They deserve safety. They deserve dignity. They deserve the right to say no without being called ungrateful for it. The little girl I was still lives somewhere inside me. I no longer silence her or ask her to move on faster than she is able. I listen to her. I protect her. I built a life large enough and steady enough that she never has to sit by another window, watching a parking lot, waiting for footsteps that are never going to come. And if there is one truth I want someone hearing this to carry with them, it is this. Family is not proven by blood. Family is proven by who stays, when staying costs them something, and they choose to stay anyway.